So I want to talk to you just a couple of seconds about how we find people of that caliber, all the speakers that we have that come to Mad Scientists. And it comes from you. All right. For example, Professor Fischhoff will be speaking next. I reached out to Carnegie Mellon, Dr. Kieran Skinner, and I said, I need a speaker to speak on some of these notions of the far future. Unfortunately, she said, well, I'd love to do it. Mad Scientist sounds intriguing, but I can't. The person you need is this. Professor Fischhoff, he's the person. So when we reached out to him and he sent us his bio, it was 45 pages long. So I am going to read you just a little bit, but I'm also going to encourage you to go to the APAN site and find out more about this amazing scientist. Dr. Baruch Fischhoff is the Howard Heinz University Professor of Social and Decision Sciences and Engineering and Public Policy Head at Decision Science Major. Okay? He's a graduate of the Detroit Public Schools, and he holds a BS in Mathematics and Psychology from Wayne State University and a Master's of Arts and a PhD in Psychology from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is a member of the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences, and he is past president of the Society for Judgment and Decision Making and of the Society for Risk Analysis and the recipient of its Distinguished Achievement Award. He is involved or leads or chairs an amazing number of professional societies, and he has co-authored or edited over 11 books pertaining to judgment and decision making. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Fischhoff to Mad Scientist.
Okay, great, thanks. Oh, sorry. Okay, well, I'm really pleased to be here. It's really a terrific meeting, and thanks for inviting everybody else. So So I think very much in the spirit of the last panel, I think the challenge for us is to say, how might we be useful to you? So I thought what I would do is I was taken by General Perkins' slide yesterday. I tried to find an image of it, but I couldn't find one online. And because here's your world, where might we fit in? But we were fortunate to have a visit from General McMaster a few months ago. By way of follow-up, his staff sent this report, which I guess will be familiar to many of you, and had these two thematic elements were very much in the spirit of General Perkins' talk. So one could think of there being two kinds of decisions in the 6 capabilities, which in some sense are an analytic, deliberative approach to see what are our capabilities, how do we improve them, what might we get from different initiatives, and then the +1 is the more real-time decision-making that what people need to adapt the plans to realities. So if we do our work right, we should be able to help you. This is the field that I represent is decision science. This is to use General Perkins' term, our innovation system, which is if we do our work right, we analyze problems and assemble the best evidence in terms of what the problem is, do descriptive research, which is to find out where people are with respect to it, and then do interventions drawing broadly on whatever knowledge is available to try to help people. This is always an iterative process because you never get it right the first time. It may be that you didn't understand the problem, maybe you didn't understand the people, or maybe you're at a limit of what we can do, and it's important to understand what those limits are. This field is an interdisciplinary field. It's really a great field. You have kids in high school. I recommend it. I run a decision science major at Carnegie Mellon. I've done that for about 15 years, which actually tries to, well, you'll see elements of this here, which tries to help people to make better decisions. And our graduates do really well. The intellectual roots of this field, some of these names will be familiar to people who've done an MBA along the way, that at some point, well, it took several centuries, but people never figured out what was a clear way to think analytically about decision-making. Von Neumann and Morgenstern are two of the names that are best associated with that. Sort of fairly soon afterwards, there was a group, ONR-sponsored group at the University of Michigan, that tried to figure, well, how do you adapt the axioms to actions? How do you use this potential clarity of thinking to helping people to make better decisions in the world? Sometime shortly after that, at Carnegie Mellon, there was a group, Herb Simon, Jim March, and Dick Syed, who thought about, well, how can organizations help people deal with the limits to their own cognitive and information processing abilities? And then finally, my two advisors, Amos Tversky and Dottie Kahneman, sort of thought, well, what are the limits to people's ability to cope? What are the heuristics that people use to cope with a world that is too complex to make reasoned decisions? Since this has been the funnel through which people brought in emotion, translate the kind of highly descriptive work of neuroscience into more practical terms. Sometimes you can define things by example. So here's 3 nonfiction bestsellers that you may have run across. Don Ariely, the first person I think who felt in the field to figure out how to tell the story in a way that people could get. And then Dick Thaler and Cass Sunstein have their book Nudge, and then Donnie has his book Thinking Fast and Slow, which is the deepest of the 3. Here's 3 more practical books. My colleague Granger Morgan and Max Henrian have a look at how to think about uncertainty in a way that's informed both by analysis and behavior research. Dick Hoyer was a longtime CIA officer. Has a very nice book you can find it online, translating decision-making research into those terms. And John Kadvani, a mathematician, and I have a book in Oxford's very short introduction series on risk. And the field is hot. When I got into it, there were fewer than 100 people. My colleague Sarah Lichtenstein had a list. 100 people included people behind the Iron Curtain who were forbidden to do work because they used words like utility and subjective. And now it's a big field. There's a presidential directive on using behavioral insights. There's a behavioral insights unit in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Here's some of the applications that our group has worked on. They all have the same pattern: analysis, description, intervention. Repeat until you get it right or realize how far you're going to get. I've had some opportunities to work within the defense, intelligence, national security arena. In fact, the field actually got a big lift in the mid-1970s from an ARPA program that was the best interdisciplinary program I've ever been part of. And I had the opportunity to serve on the DHS's Science and Technology Advisory Committee in its first few terms, and I was a member of EPA's Scientific Advisory Board, and I was helped to stand up its Homeland Security Advisory Committee. I feel like these experiences, I've learned enough not to be dangerous in the sense of really just how complicated your problems are. Everybody ought to know how fateful they are, and to realize you can't give any advice without an extended dialogue. This is an assessment I thought might be relevant for this audience of where we are scientifically, that we've had largely parallel advances in analytical methods, in the psychology of judgment and decision making, in economic analyses that relax rationality assumptions, in statistics, big data, data mining, and organizational behavior with respect to innovation. So at Carnegie Mellon and other universities, we have people doing these things who are talking to one another. It still hasn't come together, and as we've heard here, somehow all these pieces are needed in order to do your work. I think my take on the applications landscape is that there's uneven execution, that you often have you have economists doing behavioral experiment. It's great that they're trying, but they don't realize that you need the full suite of training in behavioral research in order to do a proper experiment. You have poorly calibrated claims. A lot of the people in my field have ended up taking who get a PhD, taking jobs in business schools, and they're selling all the time. They're selling, and their talks look like TED Talks, and they sell more than they've got. Those of us who are still in liberal arts or engineering, to a point, we tend to mumble when we know something, and it doesn't help you because you've got to decode how we talk. I think that there aren't organizations that have taken full advantage of this research. The applications, like the behavioral insights, are largely manipulative, that somebody has decided that somebody isn't brushing their teeth enough, or they're using e-cigarettes when they shouldn't, or they're not putting enough of their retirement portfolio into stocks, and figures out a way to help overcome these limits. And the applications have largely been for repeated decisions. So all of these are important experiences, but they don't quite address the kind of difficult problems that you all have. So let me show you a little bit about what we do, and trying not to be dangerous, I've taken examples from other domains. So what do we mean by analysis? So we have basically two analytical tools. One is the decision tree, which most of you have seen someplace or other. It's a pretty simple representation. You start with a choice point on the left, and there's things that can happen. This is from a talk that my friend Detlev von Winterfeld gave. I asked him, and he said, with permission from his family, he recapped the story of his decision whether or not to turn their daughter, who was in the breech position. And so he tried to be useful, produced this decision tree, and what they discovered is that this is a very simple tree. It was one thing discovered that the doctor hadn't thought to tell them, well, like a third of the cases, the baby slips back. So it's not like you turn them and you may end up there. And then they got all the way down. He ran the numbers, and it turned out that his wife actually didn't care if she had a cesarean or not. So they had missed the critical fact and the critical value issue, but this is a kind of discipline that you can miss these obvious things if you don't do it. So here's a second tool. This is an influence diagram, a Bayesian belief network. It's kind of a simplified version of it. We had a project from the vaccine people at CDC trying to understand the pushback from MMR. So we try to figure out what are all the factors affecting what might be the endpoints in the decision tree of a parent deciding whether or not to do it. We found that CDC told the pro-vaccine people told a very simple story. So this is a mapping of communications from pro and anti-vaccine people onto this influence diagrams of the things that you might want to know. The pro-vaccine people say, take it, it's good for you. And the anti-vaccine people say, they always tell a story. Usually it's a horror story. And as we heard in the previous session, narratives stick with people, and thou shalt doesn't necessarily stick with them. Also, it turns out that these stories bring up issues for which CDC has a story but doesn't tell it. So the vaccine people, they know, I mean, they may not know about protecting people who are immunocompromised, but they certainly know that. But the skeptics worry about the quality of the post-licensing surveillance for vaccines. It's passive reporting. It's not perfect. It's not as good as you would want it. But the vaccine people have a story, but they neglect to tell it, and the anti-vaccine people do tell it. So one of the challenges, and for those of us who are mathy, as one of the speakers in the last is to find the sweet spot between telling something that's purely narrative and something that's so quantitative that it takes you out of the reality of people, or puts you in a position where people have to trust you that you've run the numbers and you've got the right answers. So these are the way we organize our work, and this is primarily my engineering department, is what we call computable models. These are ones that would allow running the numbers if the data needs could be satisfied, but not requiring that be the case. It's meant to force precision in defining the variables and the relationships, enough so the people working on the project, they know what they're all talking about the same thing when they're talking about post-licensing surveillance. And it does not privilege the more quantifiable forms of information. So if there's stuff that's murky, let's not leave it out because we can't compute with it. We find that this is a useful way of dealing with messy problems because it helps us to focus group discussions. It's all up there, and you can argue about what's connected with what, and that it will guide your hunt for data and expertise or something that you realize is important. There's nobody around the table who can help, who knows anything about it. Well, then you ought to go get them. It provides a platform for data aggregation, so you can throw everything you know about the breach position or about the post-licensing surveillance into that bin in your model. It's a way of structuring scenarios so that they're complete, and that the scenarios also provide a form of coherence test that you might not have otherwise. And finally, it will enable you to do computations on submodels. So that's the kind of modeling we do. When you start looking for data, then often there's more out there. When you say, we need to know something about X, then you also find, so one of my engineering students who just defended 10 days ago, she did her dissertation, Casey Canfield, who did her dissertation on how susceptible people are to phishing attacks as a form of vulnerability. She found this 100-year-old book from the Industrial Fatigue Research Board in Britain, partially part of the war effort during World War I. And there's a lot, you could guess at how well people are going to do under particular circumstances, but there's a lot out there if you can retrieve it. This is my favorite figure from the book. This is the hourly output by time of day for women covering chocolates. So you can tell whatever story you want about well, and you can decide, if they are time-stamped, you can decide when you want your chocolate from. Another part of this field is the structured elicitation of expert judgment. My colleague Granger Morgan has this very nice piece, very readable piece in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences on how to summarize and present the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, volume 369, so they go way back, had an issue, very readable issue about 5 years ago on communicating uncertainty. This is a standard representation from the Bank of England, trying to look at this is projections of the British economy. You could think about whether this does a good job of communicating how well they're able to project the future. An interesting part of it, and for which I give them a lot of credit, the dotted line in the middle dotted line in the middle is the projection. They also capture the uncertainty of the past. And you sort of say, well, we don't know. So if you listen, they say the readjusted unemployment rate for the last quarter was something. They said we could continue to readjust forever because we don't actually know what's happening. So you think about the future projection. I mean, they realize that they can't be any more certain about the future than they can be about the past. But it's important to know that if you're trying to if you need to take action based on what they know. And I had a piece in Science that summarized last fall that summarizes these kinds of things about modeling. So how do we think about what do we do when we do descriptive research that is trying to understand where people are vis-a-vis a particular decision? So one way to think about the behavioral research is that behavior follows simple principles. I think probably the way Herb Simon, one of the founders of AI, this is the way he would tell the story. So we have principles of judgment, which is how people do situation assessment, and then principles of choice, which is how people decide what they want to do. We have a lot of principles of judgment. So one of them is that people are good at tracking what they see, but not at detecting sample bias. It turns out you show people, experiment I often describe in class, is you show people a set of words and ask them to come up with rhymes. So you're focusing them on the end of the words, and then you ask them how many words started with A, B, C, and D, and it turns out that they know. And there's big disputes about how people do this. Does each of those words have a separate exemplar and then you integrate over them, or do you have a token for words starting with A for this, that's stronger, it's reinforced each time? But people often don't think about whether the sample they receive is representative of reality, and once you know, it's hard to tell. You listen to politicians, or you watch advertisements, or you read the news, you know they're not giving you a random sample of evidence, but you have to stop to think, and then if you do, you don't know what actually is out there. We have some principles of choice, that people are insensitive to opportunity costs. So people tend to focus in on what they think they're going to do and then don't fully flesh out the alternatives, and you need red teaming, or you need something else in order to make that. It doesn't happen spontaneously because you can't really hold these two fully fleshed out views of the world at the same time. So these are truncated lists of principles. There are people who spend their life on arguing about each of them. So there's this vast literature out there, and in order to take advantage of it, you need to know everything that's out there. You also need to have two people who work on opportunity costs, or two people who work on frequency and encoding, in order to know what the range, unless they're very candid, you want to know, well, how good is any of this evidence. So behavior follows simple principles. However, the set of principles is large. The contextual triggers are subtle. Sometimes you're suspicious of the evidence you see, and sometimes you're not, even those of you who are in the business of being suspicious. And the interactions between them are complex. So if you look at the, I don't think it drives me nuts, and drives my wife even nutser, it is that you'll see in the Sunday New York Times, you read it in the Sunday Review section, there's always one or two people, there's always usually like two op-eds with somebody who's done an experiment and oversells the result as the way you should change your life. And sometimes there's controversies. There was one about a year ago that I'd been the editor of the paper and it had been rejected, and they still some publicist got them in, and it was published. The paper that that the journal rejected was given in the link to the paper. So it's much more complicated. You don't know how these things are going to balance out. So each case needs needs dedicated treatment. So here's something our conversation yesterday got me thinking about. So I've been doing work with some people in critical care medicine at UPMC, and one of them is somebody described her as a reflective trauma surgeon. When they're working, you want them to work, and then Deepika Mohan's her name, and she stops to reflect on it. And one of the problems, she said, is there are people who the regional hospitals don't always make the right decisions about transferring people to Presby, our tertiary main medical center. And that archetypal case will be an older person who falls. There's some chance of intracranial bleeding. Could be either cause or effect. They say, well, let's do a CAT scan and find out what's going on. By the time they've got the results from the CAT scan, you've missed the golden 2 or 3 hours, and that information has negative value. You're worse off for having gathered the information. And actually, there's no way the information could have been valuable, but people do it. And we've been trying to figure out, what is the problem? Is it a diagnostic problem, or is it a incentives problem? That is, can they not see this, or are they being asked to keep the business locally? Or they sent somebody needlessly last time, they got chewed out and they don't want to get chewed out again. So we developed, combining their substantive knowledge, our group's decision making, decision science knowledge, produces fairly realistic stimuli that we used in some. I've been using in a series of experiments, and got some idea of actually, it turns out that there's two groups. There are some people who get the signal, you're really good at diagnosis, but something about their diagnostic ability wants them to keep the cases that they can't really deal. And then there's people who've got the right decision-making rule, but actually aren't very good as diagnosticians, and they need different. That's a form of heterogeneity that needs needs different treatments for the two groups. So the interventions are our way of seeing whether, well, this is our return on investment for people having supported this research and the test of whether we know anything. So here's the intervention that we did, that Deepika and the others have done. It's a serious game. That you're in an ER, I can increase your cognitive load by taking away the number of bays you have. You can have 4 or 8 bays. It apparently works really well. It crams an 8-hour shift into 48 minutes. It has things like this, which the doctors apparently really like. Somebody comes up and says, hey, there's a drunk patient in the waiting room who is becoming really disruptive. I need you to come assess him. And this is just as you've gotten in lab results on somebody. Or there's another one where somebody wants to know where the gift shop is when you're, So, and we think that there's some, so this is a kind of intervention that builds on those other things. Here's a poor communication for decision making, a typical patient package insert for a pharmaceutical. We've been working for a number of years with people at the VA Outcomes Group and at Dartmouth in developing a display that would inform people about drug fact box patterned after the nutrition fact box that would give you the information you needed to make an informed decision about whether to take a product, or for your physician to know. It's really hard to find it for physicians to find this information. There are a lot of people with it gives you numbers. It's got a good structure. There are a lot of people tell you can't give people these numbers. People are too innumerate to do it. And as we read it, our evidence suggests that if you do your work right, that people are properly motivated people can find the information that they need. It doesn't make them pharmacologists, but it does enable them to do it with sort of if you check out this paper with representative samples of Americans, I don't know, 70% of people can find the information that they need. We've done some other work with FDA, which has been under a lot of pressure to make its decision-making more transparent. So they have this document, and they've rewritten their procedural guide to organize their information in terms of this simple decision-making table. The 2x5 table. The rows are the issues that FDA wants to make certain are covered. The boxes are small enough that you have to do some selection to say what is most important to you when you think about the condition. Makes an explicit distinction between, on the left, evidence and uncertainties, to say we want to know what the uncertainty is, and then on the right what it calls conclusions and reasons, which is to say everybody's got an opinion on these review panel. You do pharmacokinetics, but you still know whether, which is a narrow but important part of it, you still know whether or not you think this drug should be approved. They say, tell us that. Don't let that contaminate your summary of the evidence, and we'll carry that forward, and the person who has signatory authority can know that. It seems, from reports we get, it seems to improve the group work because everybody knows that they're represented. They get a chance to express themselves. So this is the way the review teams are now organizing themselves, and as of this year, FDA is beginning to report the public approval decisions in this way. So these were the points that I was just saying. So it recognizes scientific and policy judgments, quantifies the quantifiable without ignoring other concerns, highlights the ethical and political trade-offs rather than bearing them in a metric, like quality-adjusted life years for those who've run across it, and it supports risk management. So this is an attempt to draw on take advantage of their substantive knowledge, their institutional constraints, and to bring in what we know about decision science. FDA realized in the course of doing that it didn't know enough about what the patient experience was. So it's had a set of quarterly listening to patient sessions, not the patient representatives, not the drug company representatives, but a patients on. There's one. There's very moving. You find these on the webcasts online. A very moving one on sickle cell disease, and because they realized there's a kind of information that they were missing from their normal ways of gathering information. And so a few years ago, I had the opportunity to chair an academy committee sponsored by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence that tried to translate what Steve Reber here was somehow behind the scenes there to translate what we knew in the social behavior and decision science in a term that could be useful. We produced a short consensus report and then a book of readings, which we use as a text in one of our graduate courses on this. We translated our objective as to enhance the human capital of the entire intelligence community. So we focused on the people and any technologies only secondarily. Our recommendation was that everybody should have conceptual mastery of basic analytical methods. Organizational processes should support sound decision making so that you recruit, reward, and retain the people that you want. We want to rely on established science, not what somebody is selling to you, but what has gone through peer review. You want to evaluate everything. And we made no request for research funding, which we got some flack from the academy people, because we said, if you can find this dialogue, we will find something that is mentioned in the last panel that academics want to do and that could be of use to you. what's the established science? These are the chapters in the textbook. They're available online for free. We feel that this is the philosophy, the pedagogical philosophy that guides this decision science major, is that it's one thing to have computational, technical ability in doing game theory or statistics or probability, and it's another to make that part of your normal way of thinking. So one of the highlights of my academic career is I had a student who came back for spring carnival and stopped by. He was nice enough to stop by and see me and said, you know, he said, I can't turn it off. That somehow I translate. Sounds like he was a little bit insufferable to other people, but it was good news to me. So here are some things that everybody could think about, help them as individuals, but also improve the level of discourse. If you and I know what a queuing phenomenon is, we can have a kind of discussion that we couldn't have otherwise. And then here are these processes for making the organizations work. So what I'd like to conclude with, and much in the spirit of the final column, is how do you create these collaborations where people in the academic world are able to help you with your problems? And again, as one of the speakers of the last session said, everybody's busy. If you want really busy people, you've got to make it interesting for them, and you've got to keep them from being dangerous. So I thought briefly about three kinds of organization. So the first is a kind of episodic mobilization. So during wartime, people drop everything and come to the cause. The American Soldier Project during World War II was a marvelous, this is a summary, it's also available online by Paul Lazarsfeld, one of our great sociologists, that actually not only helped the war effort, but laid the intellectual foundations of American social science perhaps for the next two or three generations. So we in academia need you as much as we'd like to think that you need us in some problems. Second thing is to create some kind of a standing advisory body. So FDA has been doing this. They started in the second Bush administration and have seen through the Obama administration. They call this risk communication, but that's their funnel. They were taken to task by the Institute of Medicine for poor communication as part of medical errors, so this is their funnel for doing it. There's a statutory committee where they can bring, that I had the honor of chairing for its first few years, where anybody in the organization can bring to us, and we'll have a hearing, we'll assemble the evidence and let you interrogate us. We produce recommendations for things like, how do you deal with emerging events? So people seem to be getting sick at, seems to be a lot of salmonella someplace or other, and you think it might be Chipotle. But you don't want to go too soon because that's bad, and you don't want to go too late because that's also bad, and it looks like a cover-up, and people have gotten sick. So we came up with these guidelines that they could use for food, drugs, cosmetics, all the things that they regulate. So you had a common philosophy. And then finally, I had the wonderful privilege many years ago to spend a year at the Medical Research Council Applied Psychology Unit. This is their building on Chaucer Road in Cambridge. The building was amazingly bought by one of the heads. He got tired of waiting for the government to put up the money, so he just bought it and gave it. So you can always hope that will happen to you. The Medical Research Council, it was funded, the precursors were from before. They did things like, we worked on the Cambridge cockpit, which had for some of you may be familiar, had an important role in the Battle of Britain, getting people into the air more quickly with fewer accidents. They did, General Perkins liked it, they did targeting as well. Their model was they had the leadership of the leading British cognitive and experimental psychologists of their day, who had the vision and the personal leadership and the intellectual ability to address these very hard problems and to make other people work effectively on them. They got their incentives. They had an interesting set of incentives. They required people to publish in the top peer-reviewed journals and to demonstrate that they had been useful. And that seemed to be a formula whereby you could continue to recruit the best people, keep them and keep them fresh over a long period of time. And then finally, Alan Badley, who was a leading cognitive neuroscientist, who was the head when I was there, Alan said that the need for collaboration comes from recognizing that we don't have just basic science that somehow gets applied, but that there are these two intermediary activities, what Alan called applied basic science, which is we take the things that we think are true and see whether we can make them, whether we even have predictions in a real world setting, and then, which is sobering and enlightening for us, and then basic applied science, which are pursuing fundamental topics that arise in applied context. There's things that would never come out endogenously from a research program, but could come up with, but you will discover, and when you work with people who've got hard problems and you feel committed to help them, and then it's your job to argue argue with the editors that this new stuff is worth studying, which is what my advisors did when this field of decision science got going 40-odd years ago. So thank you.
I think we have time for one question.
The question?
Yes, Colonel McLaughlin from the Strategic Studies Group. Sir, have you ever looked at taking decision science and weaponizing it?
Well, I mean, one way you could think about that, I saw General Perkins' chart, is that we can do this ourselves to see how realistic our plans are, how we can help people to think better, to share information. But you can also think about what are the vulnerabilities on the other side. And much in the spirit of, I think it was your comment at the end of the last session, there's something people can copy our technology. It's much harder to copy our training. It's the kind of discourse that we're capable of having. I like to think that we have our students solve problems, old-fashioned, interactive, and that they can't do. So maybe that's part of making it, that's part of our secret sauce in this situation.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, sir, and sharing insights on decision science and
Thank you.
how we can weaponize it. Thanks again. So you're now officially a mad scientist with your Mood Ring Cup.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.